Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Andrew Berman, and I'm the Director of Village Preservation. And we are joined today by the Historic District Council, Save Chelsea and Save Gansevoort. We also have with us Assemblymember Deborah Glick, as well as Erik Bottcher, who is the Democratic nominee for the 3rd Council District. We will soon be joined by Borough President Gale Brewer, and we've been working with State Senator Brad Hoylman, who would be here if he could, but is working closely in concert with Deborah and Gale and us in terms of fighting to save these 9 buildings behind me: 44 to 54 9th Avenue, 351, 355 West 14th Street, all built in the 1840s, all city, state, and federal landmarks, all in the process of being destroyed as we speak because a developer is tearing them down and the city is letting them do it, even though these buildings were supposed to be preserved because they are New York City landmarks. This is a developer who clearly was most interested in building the office tower that's supposed to go up behind these 9 historic landmarks. And these 9 buildings were an inconvenience for that project. They sought permission through the Landmarks Preservation Commission to demolish as much of these buildings as possible. They received very strong pushback from the community, from our elected officials, from the local community board, and our Landmarks Preservation Commission said, well, we're only going to let you tear down a little bit of it, which we were not happy about. But now, when they started that process, by some funny coincidence, they've discovered that the buildings are in such bad shape that they can't safely remain up, and the city has said it's okay to tear them down. Something is very, very wrong here. It is just a little bit too much of a coincidence that as they started the work on their big office project, where these buildings were such an impediment and an inconvenience, that they suddenly discovered that they were so compromised that it was an urgent public safety matter to bring them down. Now, sometimes buildings do face imminent danger. When that happens, there's typically cracks in the facade, bricks falling down, the buildings list or lean. None of that was visible in any of these buildings. And in fact, for the 175 years of their life, we've never heard about structural problems with these buildings, and there were people living in them until not very long ago who also raised no issues about structural compromise of these buildings. So something is very, very wrong here, and we're here to say to the city to stop the demolition immediately, that the city must respond to calls from community and preservation organizations and our elected officials to sit down to prove what their purported public safety issue is, because frankly, we just don't see it. This seems to be more about convenience and dollars for the developer than anything having to do with public safety, and it certainly is an utter disregard for the integrity of our history and our landmarks and our neighborhoods. So I'm going to ask our first speaker to come up and join me, and that is Assemblymember Deborah Glick.
Thank you, Andrew. And I want to thank everybody who has come out today to stand up and say, this is unacceptable. The city is colluding with developers to destroy historic structures. It is not only a shame, it is disgusting. This administration has shown total disregard for New York's history. In every neighborhood where there are historic structures, this city has sided with developers. Mr. Demolition, de Blasio, yes, he has been in the pocket of developers. He has been hostile to historic communities. At every turn, he has opted to undermine long-standing precedent, allowing this developer not to go to an architect who is aware of and involved in historic preservation in order to determine what might need to be done. Instead, the Department of Buildings and LPC just said, okay, well, we'll accept your word for it, and give them carte blanche to destroy these buildings that have been here for well over 100 years. And it is, we call on the City Department of Buildings, Landmarks Preservation to meet with us and explain what procedures they have ignored in terms of holding the developer accountable. When they first bought these properties, there has been no complaint until they were ready to do their construction of their very expensive office tower. And now, these buildings that had rent-regulated tenants are on the chopping block, and our history is being wiped away every day by developers with the complete and utter collusion of the city and this mayor. So, we demand that we get a meeting ASAP before any more damage is done to these historic properties. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's wonderful to have elected officials who stand with us in this fight, and it's been a constant fight, I have to say, with this administration, which has shown contempt for the history of our city, for historic landmarks, for our neighborhoods, and in too many cases, for the rule of law as well. And also I want to just tell everybody who's holding up those signs, you'll notice on them there's a QR code. If you scan that QR code, it'll take you right to our website where you can send a letter to city officials saying, stop the demolition of these buildings right now. So please, while you're here, make sure if you haven't done that already, you do that. We need you here. We need you sending those letters. We need our voices to be heard. And the next speaker that I'm going to ask to come up here has been our someone representing our partner in this effort, Lorna Nowvé of the Historic Districts Council.
Thank you, Andrew. I am Lorna Nowvé, the Interim Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. We're the advocate for all of New York City's historic neighborhoods. HDC is united with Village Preservation, Save Chelsea, and all of you to protest the demolition of these 9 landmark structures you see before you today. As our previous speakers have said, we're calling out the LPC and the Department of Buildings and demand that these 2 agencies stop the demolition immediately. They have to provide information about how this was allowed to happen and hold the developers fully accountable. We thank Mayor of Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer, New York State Senator Brad Hoylman, Assemblymember Deborah Glick, and soon-to-be City Councilman Erik Bottcher for insisting that the demolition stop and the full accounting be provided. While the LPC and DOB cited unsafe conditions, we know that workers have been seen eating lunch on the site. Safety concerns? The buildings have been left unlocked and accessible to the public. Doesn't that make you wonder? How great is the threat to public safety to warrant the demolition? The developer, Tevin Capital, has failed to consider the many options available to ensure the preservation of these structures. Our friends at Community Board Number 4 even provided examples of how the facades could be preserved. These informed and practical solutions have fallen on deaf ears. Our city agencies are not acting as stewards of the public interest or of the landmarks law. This is a cautionary tale for historic sites throughout the city. If the LPC and the DOB turn a blind eye to the development pressures facing our landmarks and historic districts, what you see here is going to happen throughout the city. So today, HDC and its partners here demand that all work on the site stop immediately until the community is given a full accounting of the events leading up to this very sad state of affairs, as well as a detailed exploration of alternate ways to secure these buildings safely. And so we say, Tevin Capital, show respect for the neighborhood and the landmarks law, and come up with a plan that honors the very structures that will no doubt show up in as key selling points in your marketing materials for your new development. To the LPC and the DOB, hit pause, stop the demolition, and reset. Come up with an acceptable plan. Save these buildings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorna. Everybody just join me quickly in a chant of save these buildings. 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 Save these landmarks. Save these landmarks. Save these landmarks. Save these landmarks.
Save our landmarks!
I want to just say that in the last couple of days, we finally started to get some response from the city on this. It's by no means been satisfactory, and they have not paused the demolition of these buildings, but they are starting to feel the pressure. They are hearing our voice, so we have to be even louder, even more insistent, even stronger in saying that landmarks are landmarks for a reason. And there is no reason for these buildings to be torn down. I want to ask to come up here as our next speaker, Erik Bottcher, who is the Democratic nominee for the 3rd Council District, which includes all of this area.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to thank Village Preservation, Save Chelsea, the Historic Districts Council, and everyone else involved in organizing this important rally today. And I've worked in the historic preservation space for a while, and I can tell you that grassroots groups like these are absolutely critical in holding the city and all actors accountable to the landmarks process. But the truth is, it shouldn't have to be this way. We shouldn't have to be here today. This should not be happening. It's not right.
It ain't right.
So I spoke with Department of Buildings Commissioner Melanie LaRocca, and she agreed to meet with the advocates and elected officials next week. We're calling for transparency. We're calling for adherence to the letter and the spirit of the landmarks law. We're calling for the preservation and restoration of these historic structures. So we have inherited these precious architectural assets from previous generations. We are the stewards of this historic neighborhood. We are the stewards of this buildings. And it's our responsibility to ensure that they survive for future generations to appreciate and enjoy. That is what we must do, and that is what we will do. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erik. I really appreciate this. And we got a couple more speakers, and I want to say that we couldn't do this without. Still got those quick reflexes. We couldn't do this without all of you and without all of our partners from our fellow neighborhood and preservation groups. And I want to ask a representative of one of them to come up and speak next, and that is DuCroz of Save Chelsea.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, can you hear me? I hope so. Okay, is it close enough? Okay. I'm DuCroz, and I am representing Save Chelsea. Save Chelsea calls on the Department of Buildings to rescind its demolition order for these 9 row houses and to work with the developer and the Landmarks Preservation Commission on a plan that will preserve them in place. The developers say they will build replicas of these historic buildings in the footprint of the originals. This is unacceptable in light of the prominence of these buildings at this corner. The rebuilt exteriors will look like what they are, phony replacements. It's hard for many of us to understand how this entire group of buildings, which were recently occupied and show no outward signs of structural failure, are impossible to repair. DOB cannot point to any specific event that damaged these houses, but blames, quote, decades of weathering, wear and tear, lack of maintenance, and trauma from previous alterations, unquote. As if all of them, with their various individual owners and tenants over the years, somehow suffered equally catastrophic damage. There's nothing unconventional about their construction. There's no unique fatal design flaw, setting them apart from other historic buildings of their type. Walk up 9th Avenue a few blocks, and you'll find similar row houses with stores on the first floor in the Chelsea Historic District. How long before the Department of Buildings condemns them too? If historic row houses can be swept out of a developer's path, 9 at a time, for self-reported structural conditions, what landmark is safe? A terribly destructive precedent is at hand. These row houses must be repaired and preserved in place, not just for their own authenticity, but for that of all of our landmarks. The job of the Landmarks Preservation Commission is to protect the historic resources of the city for future generations. We call upon the LPC to meet immediately with all stakeholders to find a safe alternative that will preserve these buildings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diana. And I just want to quickly, before we get to our next speaker, amplify 1 or 2 points that were made previously. When we were first told that these buildings were in imminent danger of collapse and therefore needed to be torn down, I came by to take a look at them. Do you know what I found? I found the door to the building open. How is it that these buildings presented, and I went inside, how is it that these buildings presented an immediate danger to the public, warranting their immediate demolition, and they were left open to the public? I've been told by people that during that same time period, they saw workers inside leisurely eating lunch on their lunch break in these buildings that were in imminent danger of collapse. Something stinks here.
Yes.
And we need to get to the bottom of it. I would like to also invite to the podium to speak Zack Weinstein from Save Gansevoort.
Hi, can you hear me through this mask? Yes. Good, great. Yeah, my name's Zack Weinstein. I'm co-founder of Save Gansevoort. Tavris Capital, the developer of this project in back of us, features it on their website. This is how they describe these buildings. These historic buildings are, according to Tavris Capital, the developer, iconic and irreplaceable. Iconic and irreplaceable. So much for that. Now, taking the city at its word, and taking Tavros capital at its word, putting the best possible interpretation on everybody's motives here. Under this extremely rosy scenario, this unacceptable situation results from incompetence on the part of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, incompetence on the part of the New York City Department of Buildings, and incompetence on the part of Tavros Capital, the extremely well-funded, extremely wealthy developer of this site. It is so obvious that these buildings should have been properly inspected in advance. Full engineering reports should have been done in advance of this project. And if their condition was revealed to be so fragile that their structural stability was threatened by the planned interior demolition and the planned construction of a new tower behind them, then that project should never have been proposed in the first place, and it should never have been approved in the first place. Now I've got a modest proposal. If in fact, worst comes to worst, and these buildings, these historic 1840 houses are demolished, in that case, the developer has defaulted on his obligations under his Landmarks Preservation Commission application. That application should now be considered void. They should start over again from the very beginning. And because if these buildings are destroyed, it would be a travesty to create a plastic Mickey Mouse recreation of the historic structures. I would propose that this spot be turned into a memorial park, memorializing the gap in New York City's history, the gap in our neighborhood, the gap in the historic district that was created by the incompetence of the developer and the agencies that were supposed to protect the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Zach. I appreciate that. So I want to ask, we have one more speaker that we're waiting on, but I want to ask everybody to join me quickly in sending a message to the city. Stop the demolition. 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 Now, thank you. Now, let me say, the city relies on the assumption that we're all pretty dumb. They will say, well, here's some pictures of some cracked bricks in the building. That means these buildings are too fragile and too endangered to remain up, and they have to be demolished right now. Many of us have worked with an historic building or two, and we've seen conditions like this. It is not uncommon in 175-year-old buildings. And as to echo what Zach said, if these conditions existed beforehand and they just suddenly discovered them, then this is gross incompetence on their part, on the city's part, on the Department of Buildings' part, on the Landmarks Preservation Commission's part. They should never have been allowed to do the work that they did, although the city claims that didn't cause the problem. It just coincidentally revealed the problem at the exact moment when they wanted to start working on building the tower behind these buildings. That defies credulity. Until and unless the city can show that there is no reasonable way to preserve these buildings without endangering public safety, they must remain up. That is the reason why we have a landmarks law. Even though clearly our mayor has contempt for that law and has done everything he can to seek to undermine it and get around it. And this is just the latest and most egregious example of that. But we are all here today to say that our history our neighborhoods, their character, the stories behind them, the people that came before us. They are part of our present, and they must be part of our future as well. Even if Mayor de Blasio and his developer friends want to sell it out to the highest bidder, or sometimes not even the highest bidder, but the bidder who's been most generous to the mayor. That is unacceptable. These buildings have been an iconic symbol of these neighborhoods where Greenwich Village meets Chelsea, of the meatpacking district. They've stood here for 175 years. There's no way that in 2021 there is not a way to keep these buildings standing, to preserve and protect them, even if it might be a little inconvenient and a little more expensive for the developer.